Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the Lafayette Library and Learning Center. My name is Sarah Blumenfeld, and I'm the Development and Program Director with the Lafayette Library and Learning Center Foundation. In addition to sponsoring programs like tonight, the Foundation is responsible with raising more than 52% of the library's operating budget. Thanks to donor support, the Foundation ensures the library is equipped to meet the ever-changing needs of the patrons of all ages, backgrounds, and abilities who rely on the library each day. I want to thank Arinda Books, our bookstore partner on this program. Pat generously donates a percentage of all the book sales from tonight's program to the Library Foundation. The books have been signed already, and we will have an opportunity for you to have it personalized if you'd like after the program. Because of COVID, we're trying to be very careful of Emi and the contact, so if you want to have it personalized, we'll have people line up here on the side afterwards, and then you'll have a chance one-on-one to come up and have your book signed. This is also a good time to remind everyone to silence their cell phones if possible. We do have a Q&A after the conversation, and if you picked up a Q&A card, you can use that. We're recording tonight's program, so I'll also come around with a microphone if you didn't get a card and feel that you have a question you'd like to ask. Tonight, we welcome author Emi Nietfeld. She'll be discussing her new memoir, Excerpts. Emi has been writing since she was a teen. In high school, she won the Scholastic's Art and Writing Award for a portfolio of essays she wrote about her life. In recent years, her work has appeared in the New York Times and Vice and other publications. Excerpts is her first book. It's a very raw, brave, and gripping read that traces her childhood at the mercy of flawed systems and dysfunctional people. There's so much to talk about this book that we invited local author Mary Vollmer to lead the conversation. Mary is the author of 2 novels and various essays and reviews and short stories. She earned an MFA in creative writing from St. Mary's College, and that's where she teaches. So do me a favor and let's welcome Emi and Mary Vollmer.
Hi, welcome. It's great to see everybody here. We have to thank Sarah Blumenfeld for just putting events like this together, and the Lafayette Library, thank you. My book, forget the book. Learning Center for just bringing events like this to our community again and again, year after year, bringing audiences together year after year, and book lovers, because it just grows the community in ways that it's hard to describe unless you're here. We have the great good fortune today of meeting this wonderful book and this wonderful author, Emi Nietfeld. And I'm just grateful you came all the way here from New York City to join us. I'm grateful to you that you joined us today as well. And as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about why is it that this book touched me so deeply? What is it that I responded to? And I came across an Ursula Le Guin quote, and anybody who knows me knows I adore Ursula. Right now, someone is writing a new book. We won't know we needed it till we read it. And that's how I felt when I came across this book. And she said one other thing. She says, human beings don't necessarily exist inside of or corresponding to the neat racial, gendered, or national boxes into which we often unthinkingly place them. It's a mistake to ask literature to reinforce such structures. Literature tends to crack them. Literature is where we free ourselves. And once you have a chance to read this book, and if those of you who already have will know that this is a book that cracks open and lets us see the structures so that maybe, we can move forward and free ourselves. So I would just love to invite you just to say a little bit about how this book came to be. Obviously, the memoir, your life is part of it, but the building process and the moment you knew you needed to tell this story.
So I started writing the very earliest pages for this back when I was 17. And I had just been applying to college, and I had been tasked with sharing these really complicated details of my life, of being in foster care and at times homeless, and having to not only tell colleges, but having to sell the story to colleges, and having to show that I had not only survived this stuff, but that I was made stronger for it. And I found this lie, it really was a lie, to be just totally gutting. And I wondered, who am I when I've told this story? What is left of me? So that was my initial motivation that I picked back up on after I graduated college and have been working on ever since.
Right, in telling the story, too, you realize that there's a way of suffering that's acceptable and that you can put in your college application, and there's forms of suffering that are not. So how did you come to terms with that as a writer and in this book itself?
In the early drafts, I was really very much sticking to that template of what is acceptable and what's not. And I was like, I'm going to tell this sanitized story in which I am an overcomer and only acceptable bad things have ever happened to me. And it really took the prodding of people who cared about me and who cared about the story and who let me believe that it was okay to tell it.
Do you have an excerpt for us?
Yes.
Love the sound of this book.
Okay.
Keep your questions, too. There will be plenty of time. And I know that Book Talks, if you have a notebook, if you're scribbling, great, because that just helps the literature in the air, so.
Okay. So this is in my senior year of high school. As soon as my early application was in, I frantically sent in submissions to writing contests and then scoured fastweb.com for scholarships. True to her usual breeziness, my mom always acted like free money was there for the taking, but I only qualified for 2 major programs: the Ayn Rand essay contest, which required reading a 753-page book, and the Horatio Alger Association of Distinguished Americans. The latter was named after a prolific 19th century novelist whose protagonist virtue invariably leads to their success. They awarded $20,000 to 104 lucky scholars for overcoming adversity. Can you believe this? I told my roommate Jane, laughing, as I showed her the red, white, and blue website. Are you sure it's not a scam? She asked. Wikipedia says it's a real-life nonprofit organization. I wrote an essay comparing myself to distinguished American Buzz Aldrin, second man on the moon. Then I completed a checklist of hardships, which I called Adversity Bingo. I laughed while reading the categories out loud to Jane, who snapped her bracelet nervously. Thanks to everything, I scored highly. The game was so ridiculous, I felt no guilt playing. Still, I couldn't help but notice the tragedies they omitted. There was one checkbox for abuse and no bonus points for sexual assault. Even for an organization that rewarded triumph over misfortune, common tribulations were still unspeakable. Kids transcending poverty were a hot commodity, but certain adversities just made people squeamish. Every time I had to sell myself, the distinction between what produced revulsion versus what prompted praise weighed on me. I tried not to think about what I was losing, only what I could win. I stuffed manila envelopes full of my traumas and submitted them for the judge's consideration. When the facts themselves didn't depress me, I felt high on the hope that I might cash in on my sorrows.
Wow, thank you. There's these moments of honesty here where you're recognizing that you're doing this. How has your relationship to this material changed in this book? And one of your counselors said, no, that's great, tone it back on that essay, put it in your memoir.
Yeah.
I think it was Dr. Kat
Yeah.
who said that. And so how did you recognize that this is now a moment to speak truth? And how hard was that after spending so much time holding back and being the acceptable sufferer to then say, well, wait a minute, maybe there is in fact a place for this kind of truth and maybe more people need to hear it?
When I thought back on high school and I thought back on my college application essays, I remembered feeling like such a liar. Like I had all of these nightmares where the admissions officers were interrogating me. And they were asking me like, why did you cut yourself? Why did you abuse Adderall? Why didn't you put that in your application? And I couldn't remember what it was that made me feel so guilty until I went back and I read all of my high school emails. And that was when I realized that in my early application, I wrote about, these circumstances, and I also said that I had been affected by them emotionally and that I had been hospitalized, and basically I was rejected, and we got this information that it was like TMI, right? That there were too many red flags, and basically you have to go through this and you have to be completely unscathed. And that was the story that I had to tell. Right. And when I told that story, I got into Harvard. And so for me, the cost of being honest was like the cost of a whole future.
Right.
And it took me a really long time into adulthood to disentangle that. And I think I'm probably still not really there. Like, I'm still like, oh, I'm gonna get in trouble, Like, somebody's gonna say, like, this book is too much, and it's gonna impact my life.
Right, and saying that my life is too much.
Exactly,
Right.
yeah.
Well, the theme that goes through the book, too, is this questioning of this notion of resilience, which we hold up as a virtue, but can also be a way in which we sweep institutional problems under the rug and sweep people under the rug. So what is your relationship to this word when you began as let's go back to when you were a child, and then how has it evolved since?
So the Horatio Alger Conference really exemplified this emphasis on, like, we think of the phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And a lot of us, if we, might be more progressive, we think like that's a bad idea. Like, we don't agree with that. But what I started to find was that the conversation around like grit and resilience often means basically the same thing. And that when I was in therapy for kids who had been through neglect and abuse, it was really about, you need to take responsibility for your emotions, you need to change your actions, and you need to be, resilient in that way and commanding it. And so I didn't question it back then, right? Because
Right.
it was just
Right.
what I had to do. And then it was really only when I found myself as an adult unable to make the story fit. That story that like I could be this perfect overcomer.
Right.
That I was like, either I'm a failure or the story is wrong. Right. And for a long time I was like, I'm a failure. But eventually I did start to question it.
Well, and that notion that if you don't achieve a certain level of excellence, whether that be Harvard or Columbia, which was your original goal, then why live, right? We've been given these unreasonable notions of success that don't allow for a wide variety of pleasure in between. Have you found, and the process of writing that book, you certainly could become aware of it because it's all over the book, but how hard is it now to live?
Yeah. To live
to live into the small pleasures that pervade just just writing a great paragraph.
Yeah.
Versus this success you've seen. Is it something that you're still trying to balance?
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely. It's I'm definitely still a very achievement-oriented person. which is why I was like, I have to write this book at all costs, right? Like the emotional work really came from this internal drive of like, I must publish a book, right?
Oh, Dr. Kat told you to. So.
Yeah, she was, yeah, when a celebrity college counselor tells you to publish a memoir, you're like, okay, like you don't, any suggestions she gives, you're like, I will think about that, right? So it's definitely just that being present and letting go of the distraction that for years really kept me from looking back because it was so painful to look back. I was busy every minute of every day.
I'm gonna bastardize it. So there's a Carl Jung would say that we are not where we came from, we are where we're going. And your book seems to say, wait a minute. Actually, every one of us is where we came from, and there's no escaping that reality, and that where we're going is dependent on that. And that was one thing that just caught me when I was reading this girl who had no place to go. Her mother's a hoarder. She's trying to go from one foster care system into another institution, and there's no home. Like, how did you find, looking back, that process of searching for home was almost like a searching for self? I'm losing my train of thought, but it's out there somewhere. If you see it, it'll come back. But my question really is about this notion of you have to deny who you are. Is that so ingrained in our cultural myths that we can't free our kids? And a lot of us have kids who are about the age of going to college and having to create themselves on the page. How would you help them? What would you say to those kids and those parents when they're facing this moment now where you have to create a narrative that will get you to where you want to go?
Yeah. Early on in the book, when I was in this residential treatment center, which is a locked facility for troubled teens, my mom came to visit me, and as soon as we were left alone together, I was complaining about, the staff are idiots, like the rules are stupid, and she told me this story, and the moral of it was play the game, but don't believe it. Which she thought was a Christian, like, pop psychology book. But which, I mean, that would be a great title for a self-help book. Like, but I think it's actually a reference from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Okay. I think that's what it's from. But I think it was actually, in that situation, it was pretty twisted because she had been taking me to these doctors and telling them, like, Emi's sick, right. Emi's crazy, like, she needs medication, which eventually culminated in me being locked up for 9 months. Right. And then she was telling me, just pretend to get better, right? Which really indicated that it was like punishment in some way. Right. But I do think that advice was sound advice. And I think that's one of the main developmental challenges that adolescents are going through is, like, how do I hold on to myself as an individual? And I would hope that any teenager reading the book would feel like it could be possible to get through these systems and emerge with a sense of self. Even if that self is battered and takes time to, like, rise from the rubble.
Sure. That's great advice. That notion of resilience, too, when you're in the institutions, they seem to take a punitive approach to healing. And I'd like you to change the world, basically. Is that okay? Emi's going to change the world, and if you were going to do that, what would you have liked to have been treated like within that institution? And there's several that she has been confronted with over the course of the book, and so she's seen. You're seeing a woman who has seen and experienced wide varieties of treatment and knows what she's talking about. But what would you do in, say, the bulimia institution that was trying to treat bulimics? And how would you want to be treated? How should we be treating people?
When I was a teenager, I had a very strong dream. Like, I wanted to go to college, first as soon as possible, and then I wanted to go to an elite university, right? I wanted to go to an Ivy League school. And this dream dictated all of my actions, right? So I was in the residential treatment center studying for the SAT.
Right.
And that gave my life so much meaning because I had control over this one thing that was going to get me to where I was going. So the adults that were in power, they were telling me, you just need to stay alive, right? And at times they were actively dissuading me from following my goals. Like my foster parents believed that my ambition caused my misery. And looking back, if the adults had recognized that I had this powerful internal motivation and that I was willing to do anything to get it, and anything included staying alive, like getting better, not destroying myself, if we could have all rallied behind that, things would have been a lot easier for everyone.
Rather than questioning it, rather than slotting you into where the institution wanted you to be and leaving you there for as long as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Do you have another section? I was thinking of the institutional section, or that lovely quote about resilience at the end of the book. I have page numbers if you
Yeah,
want.
I believe it's the resilience section in the epilogue.
Yeah, 340 is where I have it. But
Oh,
I don't know
340.
if the pages are the same.
Yeah,
If you have another one.
yeah, okay, so, I'm gonna read about, from the epilogue a little bit. In the years after I graduated from college, it made me squirm to watch the gospel of grit make its way into the mainstream. In a viral TED Talk, the psychologist Angela Duckworth proselytized that youth in crisis needed mental toughness. From the way she talked about it, grit was more important than food, shelter, or safety. Others seem to agree. In 2015, when a cover-up of contaminated water in Flint, Michigan was exposed, behavioral scientists flocked to the city. Combating the effects of lead poisoning required unrealistic efforts, like funding for maternal health, pediatric nutrition, and early childhood education. Instead, the New Yorker reported, before many homes even had safe drinking water, psychologists were on the ground figuring out how to teach children a growth mindset. This doctrine was supposed to be for young people's own good. Society's constant problems, poverty, racism, violence, seemed intractable. Others, like inequality, were only becoming worse. Even in a country as rich as America, there seemed to be simply no hope of all youth having a fair chance. I recognize the emphasis on grit as a final throwing up of hands. Kids too young to speak would be held responsible for their own problems. It didn't matter how they were wronged or how preventable the harm. Their job was to contain the damage, making the blast zone smaller by absorbing all the impact.
Lots of references here throughout the book, too, of root causes versus treatments of kids who are caught up in this system.
Yeah.
Well, and even with your mom, when she's taking you to these doctors, there's a section in the beginning where you're being taken in and there's rats and there's filth and you have a cough. And the doctor assumes that the root cause of the cough is just some small thing. It's actually the living conditions in which you're exposed constantly.
Yeah. It was really shocking to me when I was researching the book. So in writing it, I try not to give the reader any information that I didn't have at the time, so that readers are really coming along with me on this journey and seeing things as they unfold. But it was really shocking to me as an adult, looking back, requesting these thousands of pages of medical records, to see how many doctors recognized that my mom had a problem. Like my initial psychology or psychiatrist notes said as much about my mom's potential diagnoses as they said about mine.
Wow.
Yeah, meanwhile, I was prescribed Adderall, Ritalin. The doctor wrote that my mom was giving me her leftover medications and that he started prescribing them to me to get her to stop.
Wow.
And that people knew about it. But that is really hard to solve. And that's kind of where the systems come in. That in America, like children if their parents want to send them to a boot camp, to a teen challenge, evangelical rehab facility, children really can be locked up for any reason.
Right.
There's no way for them to appeal to a court
Right.
if it's their parents' choice. Whereas parents' behavior is really, it's impossible to police. The
Right.
only tool that we have is the child protective system and just taking children away from their parents.
And how have you come to terms with that, in terms of your relationship to your mom, or have you?
It's a really difficult thing with, part of the, 19 million Americans have some form of a hoarding disorder, which is a huge number. And a big part of that problem is not realizing that you have a problem. And I think that that's a really hard thing to confront.
Yes.
Yeah, to put it lightly.
Right. Well, that notion that actually you are the cause of someone else's misery is a really hard thing to hear, especially if you're a mom.
Yeah.
Because of course you assume it too as a mom. And that goes back to that notion of root causes, and also within the institution you seem to have very little choice, very little power, and you learn to play the game. You learn that there are consequences for confronting or even telling the truth. So when was that realization? Has it been hard, or are you still trying to play the game?
I've thought a lot about this because as an adolescent, it was really extraordinarily painful to play this game.
Right.
And part of it was that my whole future rested on it,
Right.
Where I knew that if I could get into a top-tier school, that they would give me a full ride, they would pay for my travel expenses, I would be given a check to buy a warm winter jacket, and that if I didn't get in and I went to a school one tier down, I would be many thousands of dollars in debt. And so that stakes really weighed on me. And I think it's also a question of being a teenager and an adolescent,
Right.
that young people are in a different emotional place than we are as adults.
Right.
And so it's especially horrifying that 15, 16, 17-year-olds are forced to market themselves in these ways.
Right. And Dr. Svensson, is that right, was the first person really, and this was in the first institution, to say, you should go to college. Now, on rereading the book, though, I wasn't sure whether this was something she was saying to you, or whether this was something she was telling all of these girls within this one rather privileged institution. And yet, it was the key. Wasn't that the first time you said, over there, that's where I'm going to go?
Yeah.
And yet it was a castle on the hill. We're not talking the little cottage at the bottom. So, I keep saying so. I just want to hear you read more of the book, really.
Yeah.
But I also am curious about the mentors along the way. Your mom you loved your mom. There's a deep respect within the book for your mom, even as she's making life hard. But there are other people, there are mentors like Annette. So who were the people who pointed you in the right direction when you were lost?
As you mentioned, one of the catalysts of the book was that when I was 14, I was sent to this eating disorder clinic. And I had been sent to psych wards several times, and they were mostly populated with people kind of like me, from working class or poor backgrounds, who were primarily diagnosed with anxiety or depression, and often seen as having personality disorders or judged as psychotic. And at the Eating Disorder Institute, it was completely different. There were these, very wealthy girls who were treated as though their eating disorders were in manifestation of their perfection, taken too far and twisted in the wrong way. And so this psychiatrist, while I was there, she told me, I don't want you to kill yourself because I think you could go to college by the time you're 16. And I had two parents who went to college, so it wasn't a new idea for me, but to have someone who was a physician right, who wore like a white jacket with her
Authority,
name
right.
embroidered on it in purple, to have her say that to me. And not just like, oh, I want you to go to college, but you could go to college early. That was super meaningful to me. And even though it quickly seemed like it was just something that she said to everyone and that she couldn't remember it, and that from there I would go to this locked facility, even that like little misguided hope had such a big impact on my life.
Even misguided hope has an impact.
Yeah. And even unrealistic belief can too. Yeah.
Well, there's Dr. Svensson who helped. There's also Annette. And I'm curious about do you still have a relationship with Annette? Is she still helping you along?
Yeah. So when I was 14 and I was living in the facility, I asked my social worker. I never asked her for anything because I just assumed she can't do anything for me, right? Besides make my life worse. She was really good at that. She was a kind lady, but she had talents in that department. And so I really went out on a limb, and I asked her. I was like, could you help me find a poetry mentor? And she looked like I had asked her, could you send me to Mars? But she was like, okay, I'll see what I can do. And then about a month later, she brought back this woman, and she was like, I have someone for you to meet. And she's like, she looks just like you. And she was like, she looks more like you than your mom, right? And it was this woman who was from Germany, which is where many of my ancestors are from. And she was a physician who had a PhD, who had lived abroad for many years. And she was like, I don't like art. I don't think this is going to work out for us, because I could not care less about poetry. But I was just so stunned to be in the presence of such a successful, put-together person. She had a clean silver Hyundai. And I was like, oh my gosh, you don't have rotting bananas in the back of your trunk? If I need a snack, we have to you don't have Chex Mix, just under the seat?
You put the emphasis on clean silver.
Yeah.
Clean. Yeah.
And so even though we were kind of mismatched in that way, and that throughout the rest of the book, when I was in foster care and I was after foster care really struggling with places to go, when I was going to boarding school but had these extended breaks,
Right.
she was not able to give me, a family or everything that I could have needed, but she was this constant presence in my life, all through high school and all throughout college, that was intensely meaningful.
Well, and you also had what she couldn't give you, but you had art. And the search for home throughout the book always seems to come back to art as a kind of home. When did you discover that impulse? Photography was something you came back to. Your mom was the one who brought you your first journals, right? So how has art been part of the hope that you've needed to move beyond those traumas?
I actually started writing seriously for the first time I was hospitalized.
Oh.
So, and then it was because you're in this room, there's all this quiet.
And how old were you then?
I was 13.
Oh, okay.
So shortly before where the book really picks up. But it was I could hear myself think. Because at home we had these piles of trash that were waist high. There, I would be focusing on something and a mouse would just run, dart across the room because they were totally fearless. And it was in this institutional setting that I finally could tap into some internal quiet. And then suddenly there was a lot of quiet because we had hours a day of quiet time. And so really writing and then eventually photography was really the only place I could escape. Right. I could escape into. And even when a better future for myself seemed preposterous, I could write these really horrible novels about somebody who was just like me, except her name was Helen, and she lived in a major coastal city and did major coastal city stuff and flew on airplanes, right? Like Joan Didion style.
Right. Well, and then you had, speaking of Joan, the Bodega was one of those cornerstone
Yeah.
essays. And Pilgrim of Tinker Creek, the two, Didion and Dylan. Interesting bedfellows, I think,
Well,
the
they
two
were-
styles.
They were next to each other in the library.
On the library.
That's how I found them.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't that great? That's why, by the way,
Yeah.
you need to go to the library.
Yeah.
Because you never know you're gonna find next to the book that you
Yeah.
thought you wanted on the shelf. Well, and that art too, but you were always just pushing yourself constantly. And I read the New York Times article you recently published about rowing, and it goes back to my question about the kinds of suffering that we impose on ourselves and the kinds of suffering that is allowed. What have you come to understand about the nature of athletic suffering and of striving for something that's worth it and on the horizon, and destructive suffering?
For many years, I was really obsessed with this idea that I would achieve something, usually writing a book, that was going to like redeem the past, and that was going to take everything that I'd been through and somehow make it worth it. And that idea really made me miserable because I was working as hard as I could possibly work, and yet I was still affected by these things that had happened to me. And I really felt like such a failure. And throughout my adolescence, there were so many times where hard work was an escape for me. And it was this beautiful, powerful thing that allowed me to change internally and change the circumstances of my life. And I think there were also times where I was working towards a goal that I would learn was really impossible. And so as I wrote in this New York Times essay about rowing and overexercise and how I injured myself working out way too much to try to cope with symptoms of PTSD, that hard work, it can be really healthy.
Right.
And it can make your problems worse and be its own form of self-harm.
Right. And hiding from yourself, even the pain. In the article, you say, I could take joy and power of my body, but I would never be reborn. Hurting myself would never negate the ways other people had hurt me. And I found that really true and moving. And it made me look back and thought, well, in what ways, I was an athlete, in what ways have I used that kind of punishment, really what it was, in the guise of achievement to make myself worthy of the world as it expected? And I felt in the course of reading your book that someone would feel worthy just by having experienced and gone along with you with the journey, that you did a lot of suffering that they maybe won't have to do, and gave a perspective on it. But you also gave a perspective on the institutions that are doing as much harm in an effort to do good. And that includes probably Harvard in some ways. I have more questions, but I'm sure there's questions in the audience, and we want to give you plenty of time. There's a microphone in the back. You can wave your hand, and it'll magically
Raise your
appear.
hand if you have a question.
Here we go, right here. That was a good wave.
Is this working?
Yeah,
It tends to be
it's good.
pretty powerful.
All right. Well, thank you for coming and giving this talk today, and thanks to you as well. It's been excellent. So I actually grew up here, graduated from high school here, everything, and I had toxic narcissist parents, and they were very unusual for this community because they hated education and they condemned work ethic, and those are two values that are prized in La Miranda. So they made me homeless and penniless upon graduating from Maramani High School in Orinda, and I too, as a teenager, was driven by going to an elite university, UC Berkeley, and I made it and I graduated from Berkeley. So my question for you is, relating to my experience and your experience, is that I haven't spoken to my toxic narcissist parents in 25 years because their value system would not budge in the slightest, and so it was just untenable. So with your foster parents or with your mother, did you ever have a time that you stopped talking to them for a lengthy amount of time?
I don't want to give it away any. Oh, thank you so much for that question. And I don't want to give it away any spoilers.
Okay, sorry.
But I will say that it's a really, there's so much taboo in our society around speaking on private family matters, and it's like the first question that people often want to ask memoirists is, what did your parents think, right? And that question really plagued me through many drafts, right? Where I was like, how do I create a model of the world and of my youth that fits my experience and fits the way that my parents think about it and fits the way that my foster parents think about it. And that really proved to be impossible. And the more research that I did and the more interviews, the more unlikely that seemed to ever happen. So in writing this, I really had to embrace that this is a memoir written from my perspective, and that if anyone else told the story, it would be a completely different story. And I think so often when you have narcissistic parents or parents with addiction or mental health illness, you're told as a child that your perspective doesn't matter. And so reclaiming that and really embodying, like, this is my seat at the table, that has been a really powerful experience for me.
It makes me think of the title too, acceptance to Harvard, but also what other connotations can that word have?
Yeah.
Good question.
Okay, I have a question here for you. You said that you learned that you cannot redeem the past through your memoir. What was your next move after that realization?
Despair. A lot of despair. I like to say that I spent 4 years writing the first 340 pages, and then the last 3 years writing the epilogue. And in about 2018, I had a very different, that was kind of when I started to make this realization that the past was not going to be miraculously fixed by my present efforts. And yet I was obsessed with the idea that this book had to have a super happy ending. And I embarked on this process that I called happying ending, where I tried to really purify myself in mind, body, and spirit to be the type of person who could live out that happy ending. And it felt like running up a down escalator, because I was constantly encountering this material that was so upsetting about my past, and yet trying to be happy about it. So it really did take a full life reckoning for me to try to figure out what is there left once you decide that the things that happened can't be changed. And I wanted to do that with a hopeful note, because I do feel a lot of hope about the future. And so I hope that if you read this book, that you feel that I capture that at the end.
Thank you. Okay, so one other question. Were there any healthy or situations where you feel seen or heard in the foster care system that are things we should socially build upon?
That's a great question. I felt really seen at school. When I was in foster care, I went to this suburban high school in Minnesota, and I had really wonderful teachers just across the board. And my favorite teacher was named Miss J, and she was the photo teacher. And she was kind of awkward. I think to me, she resembled a turtle who's afraid to come out of her shell. But she just kind of let me be there when she was in her classroom after school, and she seemed to really value the work and the effort that I put into her class. And so even though she didn't do anything super heroic, she was the person who suggested maybe you can go to summer camp And that summer camp is what got me out of foster care and into a boarding school. And so it really changed my life. And I hope that every young person could have that experience. And for me, being in the same high school for an entire year, that can often be rare for children who are in foster care. And for me, that was really, really important and essential.
I think I saw another hand. Anybody more questions? Okay, hold on one second.
You mentioned that you spent 3 years writing the book. What pattern or schedule for writing did you have?
So the question was what my writing schedule was in writing the book. So I started writing it in earnest in November of 2015, which was a few months after I graduated from college. And in high school, I did this bizarre practice called National Novel Writing Month, where you try to write 50,000 words in the month of November. And I did this, it caused a lot of conflicts with my foster parents. I'll tell you that. And so I had done it several times in the past. So November 2015, I was like, I'm gonna write 50,000 words of this book. And so that was when I wrote the first draft. And after that, I started writing about 45 minutes a day, usually after work, and then in the weekend mornings, and then kind of over time, my tolerance built up, and I spent more and more time on it, and felt dissatisfied if I couldn't spend like a full hour or two. And so I mostly wrote in the mornings before going to work, when I was working at Google, and then kind of all day on the weekends. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, one second.
You mentioned about like the whole like mental hospital thing. Do you think mental hospitals and foster care has changed over the years from when you were in there and when you weren't?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Do you think like mental hospitals and foster care has like changed a lot in the years when you were in there and you weren't?
That's a great, so the question was whether foster care and the mental health system has changed a lot since I was in foster care. And so I was in foster care between 2007 and 2008. And most of the events in the book take place between 2006 to 2010. So kind of during the financial crisis, Great Recession era. And when researching this book, I learned that Hennepin County, which is where I was in foster care, was sued in a class action lawsuit by a group of former foster youth for like violating children's rights. And one of the things that the lawsuit alleged was that basically during the Great Recession and after, things got significantly worse. And it's, many people read the book and they think like, how could things possibly go wrong more at this point? And I think it's actually really important to keep in mind that my experience was in many ways a best case scenario. I had a lot of conflicts with my foster parents, but they were really well-intentioned people, and I was able to be there for the entire time I was in care in one home. And Minnesota is a relatively wealthy state with pretty decent social services compared to most of the United States. So I think things have changed, and I hope they've gotten better. I think there's fewer children in care than there was back then, but it's one of those things that can be really, really hard to say. Yeah.
Well, I have a million things to ask and say, but I'll try to keep it limited. First, I want to say in your book, when you're going through this and you keep thinking, if they just went to my mom's house and saw where I came from, they'd get what's going on. And then it's so tragic for you to go back and read all the notes that they knew, and yet what did they do? They just treated your acting out or you as the issue, which is so sad, and I think really shines a light on the mental health industry and stuff. But I guess it's not really a question, but just a comment, is I actually loved how, you have this big lofty goal of getting into an Ivy League school and Harvard, and you're reading this book and this memoir, and you're thinking that when you get there, like you said, happy ending, but no, things go from bad to worse in some ways, and I think it's good you didn't whitewash it, and that just was, drove the narrative even more, and you're right, it's like, what could go worse? So I guess I don't really have a question. Wait, I do have a question. So I think it's funny that were you the one that gave her penguins?
That's my husband.
Is he giving you penguins? You have this whole collection of penguins, and you end up getting published by Penguin. I'm trying, was there a connection, or?
Fate? Fate?
Oh.
Kismet? So the penguins are very special to me, and they're very special to my relationship with Byron, who's here in the audience. Because when we were, without giving away any spoilers, when we were courting, he gave me a plush baby penguin, and who I slept with like every night, tucked under my neck in my dorm room at Harvard. And as we got older, our penguin family expanded. And I'm now the proud dad of 7 young penguins, who basically dominate and control every aspect of my life. So when I met the person who became my editor, we met 5 years ago before she was at Penguin. She was working at an agency, temping, and she found the book in the slush pile, and she really liked it, but they couldn't represent it. And years later, basically, they forwarded it to her when she was at Penguin Press. And I was like, I can't get too attached to this. It'll drive me crazy. Like, I couldn't even let myself believe that she really liked the book. But then, as it happened, that is where I wound up. And it's an amazing coincidence with the Penguin. And it's also really wonderful to have an editor who has she really helped bring the story out of me and made me feel like it was okay to tell the truth. And I can't imagine what more an author could ask for in her editor.
Emi, I have one more question for you. Talking about the book, how does it feel for you now that your brave story is out there? What's that like to be on the other side with the book out in the world?
It's surreal. Everything that happens is just, apparently this is me on the cover, or it was me at some point a long time ago. But it is, I expected to be so afraid, because I published these essays previously, and the first one where I really talked about some of the dark parts of the story, I could not sleep at all the night before. It was like maybe 2 hours total in like 5-minute chunks. And it really surprised me to be like, I think I'm ready for this. And it has been just such a joy to hear from really early readers from a variety of backgrounds, and to hear that it's resonated with them and that it's been a story that they needed to read. It's been really, really wonderful.
So on that note, thank you so much for being here.